Alright everybody, welcome back for part 3 of the Justice Review. First we have Master at Arms. This card's kind of interesting. It might have some potential in Constructed, since effectively we get a 3 power 4/4 in stats, split across 2 cards, and half of it has charge. The main problem is the vulnerability. Being blown out mid-combat by removal on Master at Arms can be very devastating, and also silence on Master at Arms is fairly powerful, so the card has some weaknesses but might be good enough in some aggressive deck potentially, but it might just fall barely short of actually making it, unfortunately. In Limited I think this is pretty great, really nice common 3-drop, pick up on side, fits well into most Limited decks. Sorry about that. Next we have a cheap relic weapon, reinforced Baton, clearly not a constructed card, but in Limited this is pretty decent. It can kill the opposing 2-drop on the play, for example, and leave behind a 2/1 weapon that might do some more after. It's nothing to be excited about, but it is a playable card, I would say. Next we have Roland's Memorial. Speaking of playable cards, I don't think this is one. At the end of your turn, if a unit went to your void, give one of your units +1/+1 for each spell in your void. So this requires you to have enough spells in your deck so that this actually does something. Then it requires you to have enough units so that this reliably does something. Then a unit needs to die before this even does something, and it costs 3 power. And it also only does it at the end of the turn. So yeah, I think this card is quite bad in Limited as well as in Constructed. Too many conditions to be met. Next we have Saddle Up, also a Limited only card. 3-cost combat tricks are never great, but this is definitely a good combat trick for a 3-cost combat trick. So if your deck is looking for some ways to deal with opposing units, win combat, this might be a decent pickup. But I don't think it's too great, simply because it's pretty expensive for a trick and easy to see coming, for that matter, and clunky. But it is a decent card at least. Next we have Warrant Officer, also not playable in Constructed, and not that great in Limited, but decent. Like, we basically get a conditional, cheaper Frostkin. So yeah, if your deck is decent enough at and proactive enough at making tribute happen, then this could be pretty good. So I think in Limited this should make your deck more often than not, since tribute will happen at some point, and then just slamming this down is pretty powerful usually. Next we have Winchest Merchant, one of the weaker merchants, mainly because this basically only goes into aggressive Justice mid-range decks or Justice aggro decks, and in Justice aggro decks I'm not even sure if you want merchants or this kind of merchant. So it is pretty niche, but in the kind of decks that it fits into, it's actually a pretty solid body for a merchant, given that it has evasion. But yeah, it's really bad at blocking as a 3-power 2/2, so you really need to be aggressive enough and care about the evasion enough to make this body worth it, because you're basically skipping your turn in terms of defense when you play this. Next we have Citywide Ban, basically Eternal's answer to Nevermore in Magic. For 4 power you get to choose one of the 4 highest cost cards in the enemy deck. The cursed player can't play cards with that name. So this basically only works for like the powerful top end of your opponent, but you get to choose between those, and Harsh Will is usually among the top 4 most expensive cards in most decks that play it, so you usually can count on this locking out Harsh Will, and even on the draw it locks out Harsh Will the turn before it happens, so that's like the most appealing use for this, or locking out something like Channel the Tempest or Icaria can be pretty appealing. So this might be a nice market option for some decks, or a sideboard option, but usually nothing that you want to put in the main deck of a deck. And in limited, this is not worth even considering. Next we have Geoma, the Steel Tempest. In Constructed, this definitely has potential, but it's a bit specific, since coming down as a 3/2 on 4, this is basically has no defensive body, since it can't really block anything without trading or even just jumping, so unless you have power open to play a spell, so that's pretty problematic. But on offense, it can make up for not being able to block by playing a spell, turning it into 5/4 lifesteal, and then if you have power and a spell up on turn 5 after you attacked, thanks to the endurance, you can do that on defense too, and if you have more spells, this can get out of hand quickly. So in these kind of spells, matter type decks, this could be really good, but outside of that, I don't really see it making it anywhere, unfortunately, even though it's a Valkyrie. And in limited, this is a pretty good card. Flyers are great in limited, and a 4 power 3/2 flying endurance with such a powerful upside is still great in limited. Next we have Graceful Calligrapher, also a limited only card, but a 3/4 endurance for 4 in limited is very solid. Unseen might come in handy, so a decent 4-drop for a limited deck. Then we have Resolute Paladin, another card that's only suited for limited at best. We get a 4 power 4/1, and when you play a spell, Paladin is invulnerable to damage this turn. So with fast spells, this can be nicely used as a combat trick, and if the opponent doesn't block, you just get through for 4 each turn, which is also nice. So in limited, in the right deck, like if your deck is offensive enough, this can be pretty solid, even though the 1 health can be lackluster, but in Constructed, a big no-no. Next we have Sheriff Marley. Pretty nice name here, given Bob Marley, Who Shot the Sheriff. I'm pretty sure this is kind of like a play on this in some way, and that's where the name originated from. So that's pretty funny. And yeah, we also get a really good card. Basically 4 power 4/4 Aegis is a pretty solid baseline if you're looking to buff it up with weapons and stuff like that. The ability is much better than it seems. Basically for 4 power you get to put a 1/1 Aegis in play, or for 3 power you get to put a Steadfast Deputy in your hand, depending on what works for you. If you have 4, you just play it that turn. If not, you just make one and play it at another time. The fact that they have Aegis makes them really annoying and hard to get rid of with just sweepers. And if you ever get to trigger the tribute and she gets to silent something meaningful, she is really pulling her weight. So in the right deck, this card is a well-rounded powerhouse, giving you some staying power, giving you some utility, and giving you a hard-to-answer body for weapons. And in limited, this is no difference. Great card in limited, even better than in Constructed. And last but not least, for part 3 of the Justice Review, we have Sheriff's Head. For 4 power, we get a +3/+3 weapon, pretty normal, and on Spellcraft we get to play Detain, which I think is pretty useless actually, since Detain only cripples a unit for 1 turn, and it's really not worth waiting for that. It's not even worth a card. It doesn't really do much of anything. Really, the opponent's just not gonna use that unit for 1 turn, and that's it. So yeah, it's basically just a 4 power 3/3 weapon. Nothing great, but a decent card in limited, basically. Not a Constructed card at all. Alright, that's it for the third part of the Justice cards. The fourth and final part is coming right up, so don't go anywhere just yet. See you in a moment.